It is a strong statement to say that this is Tal's most spectacular queen sacrifice. But this game against Isaak Birbrager, who is twice Uzbekistani champion, stands out in his storied career. Faced with the possibility of a draw, Tal refuses and gives up his queen for only a bishop and some nebulous, if fascinating, pressure. This game begins with a Benoni, an opening that Tal made relatively famous, and as a fairly often Benoni player myself, I've always been inspired by Tal's games here, as well as Geshimov's games and others as well. Tal explicitly mentions that he was inspired by Rashid Nejmetdinov, who played the Benoni in a game against Boleslavsky, and he decided to switch over from openings like the Semislav because of Nejmetdinov's play. After these opening moves, we get to a position here where Black, I think, already makes a small mistake by castling, and White then makes a further mistake by castling. Common understanding of the Benoni at this point is that in this position, White should be really looking to play the move h3. So after Black castles, h3 is the correct move in this position, and probably should precede bishop d3. After h3, b5 is the sharp move, and there's a ton of theory here where it looks like Black is okay, but only if you know all of that theory. So jumping back, after both players castle, Tal, instead of playing the common move bishop g4, chooses to play knight a6. And Birbrager chooses to play knight d2 in response, which is the correct antidote. One thing about bishop g4 is, yes, you want to pin the knight and kind of take it out of the fight for the e5 and d4 squares. The dark squares are super critical in this game and in the Benoni in general. But also, the knight is amazing when it can post up on c4. So getting that pin in with bishop g4 can often be really crucial. Choosing to decline it with knight a6 is a mistake from Tal. So both players are kind of making some mistakes, but we only know that now with another half century or more of Benoni theory to draw on. So after knight a6, knight d2 is played. The knight hops into b4, which is also probably a bit of a mistake. The knight typically belongs on c7, where it can better support b5, which happens in the game, but it gets there in a weird way. And at this point, Birbrager retreats to e2. It would have been better to retreat to b1 when the bishop both eyes the king side a little bit more effectively, and it really dominates this knight on b4. This is a knight that is often cited as a knight that can end up outposted, but without anything to do. It's dominated, and it can often be on the wrong side of the board and can't be really supporting Black's queenside play with a6, b5, etc. So after bishop e2, we get rook e8, a3, knight a6, and then rook e1, knight c7. These are all natural moves, maybe not best, but natural enough. And here a4 is played to restrain the possible advance here with a6 and b5. And now knight b5, which I don't really like. White is committing to slowing down Black's play on the queen side, but I don't think you can really slow down the play on the queen side, so this doesn't make sense. Instead, you should probably be thinking about how I can generate play on the king side. After a6, there's a trade on c7, and then the move rook a2. The idea behind rook a2 is to get the rook off of the diagonal of this bishop on g7, which is a monster piece in the Benoni. And this can allow the move b4 to be played at some points, maybe after b5 and a trade on b5. And that can be an important idea for combating Black's expansion on the queen side in the Benoni. However, this is also kind of slow, and the rook ends up out of play here. It's not surprising when you see the rook on a2, your first thought is, how am I going to get this rook into the game? And the answer is, it's not going to be easy. And Tal immediately says, I'm going to take advantage of that rook being on a2. I'm going to pull my queen back over to the king side, and I'm going to start attacking. And if there's any player you should fear when they start attacking, it is, of course, Mikhail Tal. So at this point, I think there's a crucial decision, and Birbrager makes the wrong one. There are some sensible moves, one of which I would point to is the move b3, which intends simply bishop b2 when the bishop will counter black's strong bishop on g7. And this maintains like a rough balance. I think black's moves have made more sense. Tal has been outplaying Birbrager, but this is an okay position for white. The game, will continue. Instead, the move f3 is played, and this not only doesn't really accomplish anything, it's like trying to secure the e4 square, but it's already secured. White had that square covered, so this isn't really doing anything, and it blocks the bishop on e2, and Tal immediately takes advantage of that. The knight hops over to h5, and in going to h5, which is available now because the bishop is not controlling that square, it prepares f5, which is what comes next. f5, when you can get it in the Benoni, can often be strong. It can be difficult to achieve, but here, without having good counters on the e file and having a rook over here that's misplaced on a2, it's the perfect time for Tal to strike with f5, which he does. Bishop d3 is played now, of course, hoping that we'll capture here on e4, and then, white can get some trades and reduce the pressure. Instead, Tal just plays f4. And in his notes to the game, which you should absolutely look up if you get a chance, Tal says he wasn't sure about this move in retrospect because he likes white's next move. With the benefit of computer analysis, we can say that white is really busted here and f4 is the best move. The basic idea is we're establishing control over the dark squares. With this move, we really clamp down on them. The bishop can hop to e5 and d4. e5 is actually more dangerous than d4, I think. The check just moves the king over, and there are a few mating ideas, but white can defend against them. So you can just put the bishop on e5, and then you can push g5, g4, and your chances to mate are really good. Basically, you're going to stomp all over white after bishop e5, and you push the g-pawn. You can also play like king h8 and then rook g8. This attack just plays itself. It's super fun, super easy. I would love to play this position. That's why white at this point decides to play pawn g4, saying, I've got to counterattack right away. I can't just let Tal play the move bishop e5, and I'm just going to get stomped. I won't have any counterplay. I need counterplay. And this is probably the best practical try, even though it doesn't work, because it forces Tal now to play vigorously. The problem is, and maybe when Tal was 17, you didn't know this, the problem is Mikhail Tal is going to be an all-time genius at playing vigorously, playing with the initiative, creating, chances and problems for his opponent. So g4, although probably the best practical try, is playing right into a genius's hands. Bishop d4 check comes. The king moves over to h1. That's the best move. We should mention king g2 here, but after king g2, queen h4 is really strong. A tempo move hits the rook on e1, you move the rook, and then bishop takes g4 is a crushing move. Because if you take, queen takes, and okay, you can give your piece back, but that's not going to save the game, and if you pull back, then g1 is uncovered, and we have our first mate in this game. So instead, king h1 is played better than king g2, avoiding some of this. But still, queen h4, you gain a tempo, you hit the rook on e1, the rook moves, all right? Now, because the king is on h1 instead of g2, bishop takes g4 isn't immediately crushing, but it was still the best move. Bishop takes g4 is super strong, and it's kind of surprising that Tal missed this. After f takes, f3 is an excellent move that leaves the rook without good squares to go to. Okay, for example, rook d2, and yet you can just capture here on g4, and the position is dominating, and you still have this threat of mate on g1. After f3 here, you can take the knight on h5, and I would guess that Tal miscalculated here if I had to. I mean, he was 17. He wasn't flawless as a player yet, so maybe he just didn't really consider this, or he liked his other continuation better. But after this continuation, c4 is a crushing move. And the thing is here, if you don't play c4, then white's minor pieces have some chance to fight. But with c4, if you take on c4, then e4 falls and black's rooks are flooding in. It's really crushing. And if you pull the bishop back, to c2 or b1, then black can simply play the rook over, and both rooks are entering the attack very, very quickly. And this is an overwhelming position for black. Stockfish is crying out -9. You can't defend this. So bishop takes g4 was a crushing move that Tal, in fact, missed in this position. Instead, he keeps playing tempo moves in the attack. He plays queen h3, hitting the knight on f1. So rook g2 is played to cover that knight, and the queen captures on f3, offering the knight on h5. If Birbrager takes it, there are two good moves. The obvious one is bishop g2, hitting the rook and picking up some material due to the pin. Not bishop g2, bishop h3. But there's also rook takes e4 here, because if you capture the rook, then the knight on f1 falls and it's going to be mate again. So you have two really, really good choices. All right, so queen takes f3. Knight d2 hits the queen, and here's where it seems like Tal has overextended, because after the queen moves over to h3, right, you want to be keeping threats going, and this is a big threat. If you don't keep threats going, then the knight on h5 is loose, although black might be able to give up the knight with queen h3 and still have really good compensation in a dangerous attack. Or knight g3 instead of queen h3 maybe, but you can give up the knight on h5 and have a good attack, but it's murky. It's murky and not decisive. So the knight hits the queen again, the queen goes back, and the knight hits the queen, and are we going to have a draw now with queen e3, queen f3, and the knight hopping back and forth between d2 and f1? And of course the answer is no. Tal is much too vigorous of a player to be happy with a draw here. He wants a decisive game, and he chooses, even though this is a team tournament, to play bishop takes g4. And I have to give this 2 exclamation marks. Is this fully sound? I legitimately don't know. I probably think it is just a bit short of sound, but this amazing queen sacrifice creates a ton of problems and gets the win almost immediately instead of taking the draw. I think practically this is definitely the right decision the way Tal plays it. So bishop takes g4, offering the queen on f3 just for the knight that takes it. Okay, you can take here on g2 as well and get some material back. The rook is pinned, but if you take on g2, you give up all of your pressure. So the idea really isn't to take on g2 unless you're able to simplify in some way through some tactics. Otherwise, you just want to keep that rook pinned down. So let's pause and assess the position for a moment. I threw this position into both Stockfish and Leela, and Stockfish is saying it's +3. What are you doing? This is a ridiculous blunder. And Leela's saying something much closer to equal, like maybe a slight advantage to white, but like +0.4. I haven't worked with Leela enough to really understand it, but it's fascinating to see those two extreme takes on the position. From a human point of view, this is very difficult for white to handle right here. Black's pieces are obviously dominant. All of these pieces are excellent. Also, this pawn on f4 is excellent. This bishop is bad and totally restricted. This rook is pinned and can't really move. It could be captured at any point, even though we just said we don't really want to capture it. This bishop also feels kind of dominated, and the rook on a2 definitely doesn't feel like it's doing anything. Even the queen, what is the queen really doing? None of white's pieces really make sense to me, and all of black's pieces feel very, very strong. That's not enough to say that this sacrifice is sound, but practically white's total restriction and black's excellent dynamic pieces make this very difficult to meet. So there's a number of moves available to white, but it's hard to decide between them, and none of them really resolve the position. There's no forcing continuation available to white that will allow him to even give back a significant chunk of material to simplify viably. We should mention the big threat for black. It is rook e5, knight g3, and after the forced capture, there's rook h5 mate. So that threat in the position is already very, very strong, and it dictates the next move from white that we'll get to in a moment. Instead, we should mention some other possibilities. Bishop e2 is one possibility, but we can just capture here on e4 and we gain a tempo on the queen. That suggests that another possibility is queen d2, which is also recommended by some of the engines. But after queen d2, which intends bishop e2 and trading on h5 to simplify without the queen being vulnerable on c2 after bishop takes e4, you have, again, rook e5 with this threat of knight g3 and rook over, and it's very difficult to handle this position. You're still bound up if you play h4, which is kind of a critical move here to stop rook g5, actually, which would just pile up on the pinned rook and would be very, very strong, and which gives room for the king to maneuver, like knight g3 check. Now you can run up with the king and you're not getting mated. But here, you can just trade down and you're still dominating the position, even though you continue to be down, a queen for a knight. And even Stockfish at this point is going, yeah, I like black. Black is good, even despite the material count. One funny continuation is h3 instead of h4, again trying to make some room for the king to maneuver. And at this point, we could get a draw, although I suspect that Tal would have found a way to continue. After rook takes, bishop takes, the knight can hop between these two squares, and you have a hilarious perpetual. So there was still the possibility of another draw. I kind of like the move b3, and if I had to bet on what the best move in this position was, I think I would go with pawn b3, hoping to try and trade down some pieces, and also including this rook in the participation of the defense on the second rank. Again, I don't know that you're going to hold on. After rook e5, h4 is forced, and black can continue to increase the pressure, including the other rook, and it's still very, very hard for white to get out of this bind. I don't know that we can give a conclusive answer to the question of whether or not this attack is sound, but practically, again, it's very good, and black is dominating the position. Tal once said, that there are some sound sacrifices, but the rest are mine. And this is a good example of him playing an unsound sacrifice that practically is just so hard to meet. In the game, after bishop takes f3, the move Birbrager settled on is pawn to h4, which we saw in some of these other variations. It's an important idea to respond to knight g3 and the rook coming in on the h file. Still, I would have liked b3 or another move that made some progress at finishing development and coordinating the pieces, since h4 is not forced yet, right? So I think that that's an important point. h4 is not forced yet. Let's hold on to that. If rook e5 is played, then we can play h4. Maybe Tal doesn't play rook e5, although he probably will, and will be forced to play h4 in a moment. So after h4, Tal simply plays rook f8, bringing over the rook and giving this rook more scope to be included. And maybe this bishop moves, and then the pawn can advance to f3 in some lines. Bishop e2 is played to try to simplify here, and unfortunately for Birbrager, 2 moves after Tal has sacrificed the queen, he is now lost. So this is the losing move. We can give a question mark right here. After knight g3 check, king h2, it's simply a forced loss because of bishop takes here on g2. I said we didn't want to take the pinned rook. We wanted to keep it pinned and keep our strong bishop. But if we get the opportunity to simplify, we'll go for it. So we go for bishop takes g2. And after king takes g2, knight takes. You can choose not to take the knight, which does leave us in a losing endgame. But if you don't take the knight, then black has regained the material successfully at this point and is doing quite well. So, not having a good choice, Birbrager does choose to take the knight, which is basically accepting that we're going into a losing endgame. The game is over. f3 check, forking the queen and king. And here we are down a pawn, but we're about to be down 2 pawns. And we're dominated. Again, the rook on a2 is not helping out. Rook check at this point. The king moves over, and a nice sequence here. Bishop check and bishop f4. And the thing is that if you trade the bishops when the rook recaptures, then we've got 2 loose pawns. We're going to pick up 1. But if you don't trade the bishop, then I'm just going to take on c1, and I'll just put the rook on f4. So you don't have any way to avoid the loss of a second pawn right here. So Birbrager resigned in this position. One of the first victims in a celebrated game of Tal's brilliancy. I hope that you've enjoyed this game. If so, please do check out some of the other amazing sacrificial games that we've covered on this channel, and do subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of future videos. Thank you so much, and have a great day.